In this session, we'll be reading Psalm 67, a prayer that calls upon God to bless his people so that the nations will see and respond by also praising God. So, grab your copy of the Tanakh and let's get started. Psalm 67 is a short psalm with a rather distinctive theme. By the way, you will remember that in most of the Psalms, the verse numbers in English translations are one number lower than in the Hebrew tradition, because the Hebrew text assigns a verse number to the superscription, but the English tradition does not. For this session, we'll be following the Hebrew tradition of verse numbers, since we're reading the Hebrew text of the Psalm. The English verse numbers will always be one verse number lower. The superscription to the psalm reads, Lamnatseach Binginoth Mizmor Shir. This is a pretty standard superscription. The phrase begins with the word Lamnatseach. Here there's a minor variation that we might notice. Samuel ben Jacob, who was responsible for the copy of the Hebrew Bible that we call Codex Leningrad, which is the basis of our BHS text, apparently made a mistake here and omitted the furtive pathach of the Cheth. Or if he did not make a mistake, then the copy that he was working from omitted it. In any case, the text should read Lamnatseach rather than Lamnatsek. It's a minor point that doesn't really affect meaning in any way, but it does earn an entry in the textual apparatus. In any case, the phrase indicates that the song was for, or perhaps written by, the person indicated by this PL participle. Now, the person dedicated by the participle is not entirely clear, but with the related verb, it deals with the idea of oversight or superscription. So it's generally understood to refer to the person responsible for supervising the music or the choir of the temple. So it's commonly translated choir director. The second word, binginoth, is the noun nagina with the preposition beith. This noun is related to the verb nun gimel nun, nagan, to play a stringed instrument. The beith indicates the means by which something's done. So this is typically translated on a stringed instrument. The last phrase is comprised of two words that both basically mean a song. The first word, mizmor, is used exclusively, some 57 times, in the superscription to various psalms. It is never used anywhere else in the Tanakh. We typically translate it as a psalm, but this word is not the word used for the title of the book of Psalms. So the translation can be a bit misleading. The second word, shir, is a more generic word, occurring more often and also outside of the book of Psalms. These two words occur together 15 times in the superscription of the Psalms, but generally they're modified by some other phrase indicating the author or something else about the song. Hence, the textual apparatus tells us that many manuscripts add the phrase le David at this point, to or for or by or about David. Without that addition, it's difficult to know exactly how to render these two words. Most English translations end up taking them as appositives. We'll do the same, reject the textual addition, and read them as appositives. So, for the choir director, on a stringed instrument, a psalm, a song. Like most of these superscriptions, it's not really very helpful. But remember, these superscriptions are not part of the inspired canonical text, so we won't trouble ourselves too much with it. We'll take verses 2 and 3 together since they constitute a single thought that states the main theme of this prayer song. Elohim Yechanenu Yivrakenu Ya'er Panau Itanu Selah. The verb in the first stitch is a call imperfect of the root Cheth Nunun, Hanan, with a first plural object suffix. We could take this as an indicative and read, God will be gracious to us. Or we could take the same form as a jussive and read it, may God be gracious to us. Remember, for the majority of Hebrew verbs, the indicative and the jussive are the same form. This creates a problem for us that occurs over and over again throughout the psalm. There are a number of places, perhaps as many as 12 different verbs in these 7 verses, not counting the superscription, where we have to decide whether to take the verb as an indicative or as a jussive. No translation that I looked at takes them all as indicatives, and none take them all as jussives. But translators disagree about which ones to take which way. After looking at this text for a while, I've decided to take them by default as jussives, unless the context suggests otherwise. So rather than comment on each one of them, I'm only going to mention this when I decide not to take it as a jussive. So I'll read this as a jussive. May God be gracious to us, and may he bless us. The next phrase, Ya'er Panau Itanu, creates a little bit of a curiosity. The verb is easy enough. It's a hiphil of the root aleph waw resh, or. In the call, this verb is intransitive, and it means to be bright or to shine or to be light in the sense of shining a light. In the hiphil, it's transitive. That is, it takes an object. In this case, since we're talking about the jussive, we would naturally read, may his face, or his presence, enlighten us. Or more traditionally, may his face shine upon us. There are 2 things to say about this. First, the idiom to cause the face to shine upon something is an idiomatic way of saying show favor. So if we wanted to communicate the sense of this idiom, we might read this last phrase as, may he show us favor. But there's another curiosity here. The context and the influence of the Aaronic benediction in Numbers chapter 6, verse 25, pushes us in the direction of taking the Hebrew form itanu as the recipient of the favor that the psalmist wants God to bestow. The problem is that, grammatically speaking, this is difficult because the word itanu is pointed as the preposition eighth, meaning with, not as the direct object marker. That would be othanu, not itanu. This idiom, to cause the face to shine, occurs 19 times. In these cases, the recipient of God's favor is marked in a variety of ways, with the preposition el and with the preposition al. In addition to these, other hiphils of this verb take the prepositions lamed and beith, and a few take the direct object marker. And some occur with nothing at all to mark the object. But this is the only place in the Tanakh where the hiphil of the verb or is used with the preposition eighth, meaning with. So what do we do with this? Well, we could just ignore it and read it as if the words are the same as they are in the Aaronic benediction, where, by the way, the verb occurs with the preposition el. That's more or less what most translations end up doing. Or we could argue that this word is mispointed and should be the direct object marker, othanu, instead of the preposition itanu. That makes more sense grammatically because, as we said, the direct object marker does occur with other hiphils of this verb, though not in this particular idiom elsewhere. Or we could read it as it is, taking the base to indicate association, in which case we would probably read, "May he cause his presence to shine among us." Frankly, I kind of like that last option, but no published translation, and only a rare commentator are willing to take it that way. So while it's a bit of a grammatical curiosity, the overall sense of a prayer for God's favor and blessing are clear enough from the text. Finally, we come to the last word in this verse, Selah. Let's be honest here. No one really knows what this word means. It occurs 74 times in the poetry of the Tanakh, 71 times in the book of Psalms, and 3 times in the Psalm of Habakkuk, chapter 3. The best guess is that it's some sort of musical term. This guess is based on the observation that it occurs most often in those psalms whose superscription contains either lamnatseach or mizmor, or both, as is the case in our text. Since this term is associated with these other terms that are regarded as musical terms, we guess that this is also a musical term. And that's really about all we can say about it. There's a lot of speculation. The most common guesses are that it indicates either a key change or a musical interlude. I suppose we would have to take it as a guitar solo, since the superscription to this psalm says it is to be played binginoth on a stringed instrument. Well, the problem with either of these suggestions is that the word occurs in an unusual location, right in the middle of a thought. One would expect either a key change or a musical interlude to occur at the end of a thought or between thoughts rather than in the middle of one. So all we can do is observe that the word is there, leave it at that. So the poet prays that God's presence would be among them. L'da'ath ba'aretz darkecha b'kol goyim mishuatecha. Here again we have a bit of an oddity. The first thing to notice is that there's no verb in the second half of the line. So the verb at the beginning of the line serves both stitches, and we have to insert it again in the second stitch. Now, that's not really unusual. It's actually a pretty common thing with Hebrew poetry. And when it happens, we usually say that the verb is doing double duty. The oddity here is that the verb is a call infinitive construct of the root yod dalet ayin, yada, to know. From the context, we might expect this to be a nifal and read, so that your way may be known on the earth. Or perhaps a hiphil to read, in order to make known your way upon the earth. But we don't have either. The call just doesn't seem to fit logically. And since the verb serves both stitches, as we've already seen, the difficulty extends to both parts of the line. Whatever solution we adopt has to work for both parts. There appear to be 2 ways of understanding this. The first is to assume that the poetry leaves the subject unexpressed in both stitches, and we have to supply it. In this case, we would take the phrases "in the land" and "in all the nations" in the next stitch as shorthand for everyone who lives in the land and in all the nations. And if we go that route, we would read this line something like this: so that everyone on earth will know your way, and everyone in all the nations will know your salvation. That works pretty well and also seems to fit the context. The other possibility is to argue that in this case, we should just read the call as expressing a passive idea. Of the major Hebrew lexicons, only the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew suggests that this is a possibility, and they give very few examples to support this claim. So this is a bit more questionable, though frankly, a lot of English translations go that way, apparently because it's the easiest way to make sense of the text. And if you prefer that solution, then you would read the line something like this: so that your way may be known in all the earth, and your salvation may be known in all the nations. That also works fine, but frankly, I find it less satisfying grammatically. So I'm going to go with the first solution that we mentioned, and I will read this as: so that everyone on the earth may know your way, and everyone in all the nations may know your salvation. One last thing. I don't know if you noticed it or not, but we had a shift in the pronouns between verse 2 and verse 3. In verse 2, we had a third person pronoun referring to his presence. In other words, talking about God. Here in verse 3, the second person pronoun makes God the addressee, not the subject. The poet is speaking to God, not talking about him. These second person pronouns are used starting in verse 3 and run all the way through verse 7, where the poem switches back to the third person again for the ending. Now, a shift in pronouns is not by itself all that problematic. The odd thing is that it happens, like the Selah, right in the middle of the thought. So the textual apparatus notes that in some manuscripts we have a third person pronoun rather than the second person pronoun here. And while the shift at this point is odd, it's not impossible. And it's more likely that in the manuscripts that have the third person pronouns here, those readings have arisen from an attempt to smooth out the text and make it easier. So I'm going to leave the text of Codex Leningrad the way that it is. And putting verses 2 and 3 together, I'll read: may God be gracious to us and bless us. May he cause his presence to shine among us, so that everyone on the earth may know your way, and everyone in all the nations may know your salvation. This, as I said, is the major theme of the whole psalm. The next few verses expand upon this thought by looking at the hoped for response. Just as verses 2 and 3 together communicated a single thought, verses 4 through 6 also constitute a single block. In this case, verses 4 and 6 are the same. This creates a bracketing effect that highlights the call for the nations to praise Israel's God that's between them. We'll take this one phrase at a time. Yoduka Amim Elohim, Yoduka Amim Kulam. Verse 4 is a classic example of what Robert Louth in the 18th century called synonymous parallelism. The idea of the first line is repeated in the second line with only a minor variation. Here, two of the three elements, the verb and the referent, are the same. The third element shifts from the addressee, God, to an expressive modifier of the second element. So, translating rather primitively, we might read, "Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let the peoples praise you, all of them." Or we could make better English of the last phrase by saying simply, "Let all the peoples praise you." The verb is a hiphil imperfect third plural with a second person singular object suffix, you. The root is yod daleth he, yada. This verb is used 111 times, mostly in the book of Psalms, 67 times, and always in the hiphil or the hithpael. If you were to use the Bible word study tool in Logos Bible software to look at this verb, you'd notice right away that the ESV mostly translates it as give thanks, or praise, or confess. A quick look would show us that most of the time, when the ESV renders any verb as give thanks, it is this verb, yada. For praise, there's a wider variety of words, and there are a few other words that the ESV also translates confess. If we look at all the places where the ESV renders this verb as confess, we would see that the idea is confessing sins, not confessing the faith. Now, what you cannot tell from this quick look is that in every case but one, Proverbs 28:13, when the ESV renders this as confess, the Hebrew verb form is in the hithpael. And the same is basically true for other English translations. So, yada in the hithpael is used with the sense of confessing sins. In the hiphil, it's used for the idea of praising or giving thanks to God, though English translations differ on when they render it as praise and when they render it as give thanks. The thought continues in verse 5. Yismaku yiranenu le'umim. The verb samak is rejoice or be glad. The other verb here, ranan, means to cry out or shout. It's used in a variety of senses, calling for help or crying out in prayer, for example. In the piel, which is what we have here, it quite often has the idea of shouting for joy. And the context certainly suggests that that's the idea here as well. The subject is la'umim. This word occurs 38 times, quite often in poetry, especially in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah. It's mostly used to refer to other nations, but occasionally to refer to Israel. The context here suggests that we're primarily referring to other nations, since the same word is used again in the third phrase of this verse to refer to the nations on the earth. But here's a question. Why should the nations rejoice? The next clause, beginning with the particle ki, gives us the reason. Ki tishpoth amim mishor, because you will judge the peoples fairly. There are two things that should get our attention here. The first is a question. Why should the nations rejoice that they're going to be judged? This is actually pretty easy to answer, and it has to do with the connotation of the word judge. We tend to hear the word judge in a negative sense, meaning to condemn. And of course, the Hebrew word shafat does often mean exactly that. But as a legal term, it can refer to the judge ruling against you. But also, and this is the important thing here, it can also refer to the judge ruling in your favor. And when it's used that way, the Hebrew word shaphat, judge, is used as what we might think of as a gospel word. By that I mean it's used to talk about the deliverance of the people of God. To give you a quick example, look at 2 Samuel 18, verse 19. In this passage, Ahimaaz wants to give David some good news. So he says, "Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies." Now, the word translated deliver by the ESV is the Hebrew word shaphat. The good news that Ahimaaz wants to tell David is that God has decided the matter in David's favor and thus delivered or shaphated him. God's judgment is that David should escape from his enemies. So the ESV is quite right to translate shaphat as deliver in this kind of context. Well, there are quite a few other examples that we could look at where we could see this, but you get the idea. Shaphat, judge, is really a neutral term. It's what the judge decides that makes it either good or bad. And here in Psalm 67, it's good. The goodness of God's judgment on the nations is expressed by the word mishor. Now, this word choice is a bit unusual. The word is a noun related to the verb yashar, to be right or be straight. But mishor is normally used in the Tanakh to talk about a level piece of land, a flat plain, or the top of a plateau. There are only a couple of times where it's used figuratively in relation to performing justice. And in that context, this is always a positive term, implying that the judge will rule in favor of someone. So, for example, in Isaiah 11:4, we read that in righteousness God will judge the poor and he will decide with mishor in favor of the meek ones of the earth. Similarly, here in Psalm 67, we read that God will judge the peoples with mishor. That's the psalmist's way of saying that he will judge for them, not against them. Well, just a minute ago, when I translated this, I translated it as fairly. I said, he will judge the peoples fairly. And a lot of English translations express the same idea by rendering it something like with equity. Both of those renderings kind of highlight the idea of something flat, a level playing field, we might say. And that would be etymologically correct, but it does miss the point of the psalmist just a bit. The real point here is not just that God's judgment will be fair and equitable, but that it will be favorable. And that's why the nations will rejoice. The next stitch also highlights a positive aspect of God's rule over the nations. La'umim ba'aretz tenkaim, Selah. The verb tenkaim is a Hifil imperfect from the third hay verb nun cheth hay, to lead or guide. This is the verb that's used in the 23rd Psalm in verse 3. He leads me on the right path for the sake of his name. And it's also used of God's leading Israel at the time of the Exodus by means of the pillar of fire and the cloud. And in Exodus 15, this is the word that's used to describe God's leading of his people by means of his chesed, or grace. So when used of God, this word has a very positive connotation. There's one possibly ambiguous point in this line, and we might need to clarify it. Does the phrase in the earth refer to the people or to the place of God's guiding? The ESV renders this as guide the nations upon the earth, which is a bit ambiguous, but it sounds like it refers to the place that God will guide them. And the New American Standard does something very similar. On the other hand, the Net Bible renders this phrase by saying that God will govern the people living on the earth. So they take it as referring to the people, as does the NIV and the Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society's translation. Grammatically, either understanding is defensible, but I think the context favors taking this as referring to the people. You remember back in verse 3, we saw that the phrase ba'aretz, on the earth, was being used there to refer to the people who lived on the earth. So I'm inclined to agree with the Net Bible and the NIV and the Tanakh here, and take this in the sense of the people who live on the earth. Verse 6 closes this section by repeating the line that we had above in verse 4. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the nations praise you. So I don't think we need to say any more about that, except to observe the bracketing technique that sets this section apart. Verses 7 and 8 bring the poem to a close by shifting the focus back from talking to God, as it was in the prayer verses 3 and 4, to talking about him. This mirrors the change that occurred at the beginning of the psalm, as we've already mentioned. Eretz Nathana Yavulah. The land has given its produce. The last word in the phrase, Yavul, generally refers to the produce of the soil, to plants, grain, grapes from the vine, and things like that. In a few places, it can refer to the produce of human labor, or even perhaps simply to one's possessions. But here that there's little doubt that we're talking about agricultural produce. Yivar Kenu Elohim Eloheinu. God, our God, blesses us. Now, here I think we have to come back to the question of whether to take this PL imperfect verb form as an indicative or adjussive. I just rendered it as an indicative, but one could render it just as easily as adjussive and read, May God, our God, bless us. As I said at the outset, for most verbs in Biblical Hebrew, the adjussive and the indicative are identical in appearance. I'm taking this one and the next one that occurs as indicatives rather than adjussives, because I see this last statement as a summary of the theme of the psalm, rather than as a continuation of the wish or the desire of the poet. But English translations are all over the place on this point. The Net Bible, for example, translates this verb and the next one as adjussives, but it translates the last one as an indicative, expressing result. And I think they're right about the last one, but I disagree on taking these as adjussives, for the reason that I just stated above, because I see this as a summary statement. The Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society translation, takes all three of these as adjussives. The New Jerusalem Bible takes the first one as an indicative, but the second one as adjussive. So there are a lot of variations in modern translations. As I said, the form could be either one. How you take it depends on how you understand the function of this clause in the context of the whole psalm. And as I said, I see this as a summary of the theme of the whole psalm. So I'm going to render the last verse as an indicative, followed by another indicative, indicating the result of the first action. Yivarkenu Elohim. God blesses us. And note that I'm taking this not just as a simple future, God will bless us, but as a reference to the ongoing activity of God. It would also work just as well as a simple future. Vayiru otho kal afse aretz, so that all the ends of the earth will fear him. The phrase afse aretz occurs more than a dozen times in the Tanakh, nearly half of them in the book of Psalms. The usage here, and especially in relation to verse 3, reminds me of Isaiah chapter 52, verse 10. All the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. Or it reminds me of when God said to his anointed one in Psalm 2, I will make the ends of the earth your possession. Again, the use of this phrase highlights the emphasis throughout the psalm on the fact that in the end, all the nations of the earth are called to worship Israel's God. In Psalm 67, the psalmist picks up a theme that occurs occasionally, but not often in the Tanakh, that God's goodness to his people will move others to recognize Yahweh and even to believe in him. In the Exodus, a mixed multitude joined the Israelites after seeing how God had protected them. In Deuteronomy 4, Moses says that the nations will recognize what a great God Israel has by the fact that he has blessed them in giving them his Torah. In Isaiah 61, the peoples will see how God has blessed his people. And in Isaiah 2, the nations will see how God has blessed his people and will flow to Mount Zion to learn his ways. But nowhere in the Tanakh is this theme expressed as directly and explicitly as it is here. What God says to Abraham in Genesis 12 is true of all of God's people. They are blessed to be a blessing. And this is a salutary reminder to us because we too often fall into the trap of thinking that it's all about us. In the account of the Exodus, God performs mighty acts on behalf of his people so that Egypt might know that he was God. And he still blesses his people so that others will see and be drawn to him. God does indeed love his people, but he also blesses them so that those who do not yet know him recognize who he is and be drawn to praise him. And that's the theme of our reading today from Psalm 67. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me as we've read through Psalm 67 in the original Hebrew text. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another opportunity to study God's Word together in the language in which He inspired it to be written. Until then, shalom in Jesus.